The day I realized my front yard had become a crime scene, it was over 4 plastic barrels and a line in a rulebook I had never bothered to read. I was standing on the driveway, staring at them like they might suddenly sprout sirens and flashing lights, while the sun beat down off the pavement and made the air shimmer. Somewhere a lawnmower droned like white noise, but in my head, all I could hear was a single question: would the association really charge us $100 a day until we ditched them? The letter in my hand felt heavier than paper should. It was only a single page, printed on stiff white stock with the association's logo at the top, but every word was like grit in my teeth. It called my rain barrels unsightly containers. It used phrases like urgent compliance and subject to daily fines. It gave us a deadline. It told us those barrels had to go. I looked from the page to the barrels again. 4 dark blue cylinders tucked neatly at the corners of our gutters, connected by simple downspout diverters. They weren't leaking. They weren't falling over. They were just standing there, catching the tiny bit of rain that ever passed through our drought-starved sky. The plastic was warm under my fingers, almost soft in the heat. If you've ever watched a homeowners association drama from a safe distance, you know the beats. A rule. A petty enforcer. A homeowner caught between the community standards and plain common sense. I used to roll my eyes at those stories. That would never be us, I thought. Our neighborhood was calm. Respectable. Boring in the way real estate agents love to describe with words like serene and tight-knit. I didn't know yet that these 4 barrels were going to turn our quiet cul-de-sac into a slow-motion uprising. I just knew that we were being threatened over rain in a town where the grass had forgotten what green looked like. The first ember of anger sparked somewhere low in my chest. It didn't flare up all at once, it glowed quietly, like a coal waiting for the right breath of air. As I folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope, I had no idea that this was the opening scene of an HOA nightmare that would drag in the entire street and end with every yard lined in protest. All I knew was that they were coming for our water, and I wasn't sure yet how far I was willing to go to keep it. To really understand how ridiculous it all was, you have to picture the place where we live. Our subdivision sits at the edge of a city that's been in drought so long the word restriction might as well be part of the welcome sign. The lawns are mostly a mix of stubborn Bermuda grass and hopeful patches of drought-tolerant shrubs. On summer afternoons the sky turns into this flat, endless sheet of white blue, and everything feels baked and brittle. On the rare days it rains, you can smell dust lifting off the sidewalks like the world is exhaling. The city, to its credit, tried to adapt. They pushed conservation hard. There were workshops about xeriscaping. Rebates for low-flow toilets. Flyers in our mail about watering schedules and fines for letting sprinklers run down the curb. And then, in a moment of actual inspiration, they launched the Rain Barrel program. It was simple: sign up through the city, attend a short online session about water conservation, and you could buy subsidized rain barrels. Up to 4 per household. They even encouraged people to post photos of their setups to inspire neighbors. The city's brochure showed tidy barrels painted to match houses, tucked beside garages, decorated with stencils and vines. There was one line, though, that should have been my warning. At the bottom of the brochure, in smaller print, it said, "Participation subject to community covenants where applicable." Our community covenants were a document I had technically agreed to years ago, sitting at a glossy closing table, initialing here and signing there. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions, our CCRs, were bound in a thick booklet, printed on off-white paper. At the time, I treated it like furniture assembly instructions in a language I didn't speak. I trusted that if something important came up, someone would tell me. The someone, as it turns out, was Ms. D. Ms. D was our HOA president, a woman who could spot a non-compliant trash can from 3 streets away. She was always walking, always watching, always with a clipboard or a phone in hand. Her yard was immaculate: symmetrical shrubs, perfectly edged grass, flowers that never seemed to wilt. She seemed to treat the CCRs less like guidelines and more like holy scripture. I had seen her in action before. She'd left notices for a neighbor whose holiday lights stayed up into February. She'd reminded another that their mailbox needed a fresh coat of paint. There were stories of her measuring lawn heights and sending emails about patio furniture color schemes. People joked about her, but most of us played along, trimming and painting and hiding our trash cans behind fences. What I didn't realize until the barrels arrived was just how much power she thought she had. The specific rule she cited later came from a section I had never read. It was CCR Section 7.4, the Exterior Modifications and Containers Clause. Buried in a paragraph about storage sheds and lawn equipment was a single sentence: no exterior containers or receptacles shall be placed in view of the street without prior written approval of the Architectural Committee. On paper, it sounded reasonable. In practice, it was a loaded weapon in the hands of someone who believed uniformity mattered more than survival. The drought had tightened that year. The city sent us Stage 3 restriction notices with red headlines. No daytime watering. No washing cars at home. No spray irrigation more than once a week. The grass in the common areas turned the color of toasted bread. The little retention pond at the end of our street shrank into a cracked bowl. Inside, we tried to do our part. We timed showers. We reused gray water from rinsing vegetables to water a few potted plants. Our kids learned to turn off the faucet while brushing their teeth. When we saw the email about discounted rain barrels, it felt like a no-brainer. Why waste the precious little that fell from the sky? We signed up immediately. A few weeks later, a delivery truck dropped 4 glossy blue barrels and a kit with downspout diverters and hoses. I remember how excited we were, like kids unboxing some futuristic gadget. The plastic smelled faintly chemical as we tore off the wrapping, but there was something hopeful in it too, like the smell of new school supplies at the start of a year. We placed the barrels at the corners of the house, where the gutters ended. They lined up neatly along the side yard and behind a low hedge in front. From the street, you could see the tops of 2 of them if you really looked, but they weren't shouting for attention. They were just there, waiting for clouds that never seemed to come. The first time a storm finally rolled in, the whole neighborhood changed. The sky darkened, thunder rumbled in the distance. You could hear the first fat drops hitting roofs and driveways. When the rain started pouring off the eaves into the gutters, our barrels filled with this deep, hollow drum sound that felt almost musical. For once, instead of feeling guilty watching water run down the street, I felt smug. Every splash was ours to keep. That night, we stood under the porch light and checked the levels. Each barrel was nearly full, the captured stormwater sloshing gently inside when we tapped them. It felt like we had done something small but meaningful in a world that kept asking for sacrifice. I didn't know that while we were admiring our conservation project, someone else was already planning their case against it. A few days after that first storm, I spotted Ms. D walking past our house. Clipboard in hand, visor on, she slowed as she reached the front corner. Her gaze flicked toward the barrels, lingered, moved on. The air was still, a sprinkler down the street clicked and hissed, sending a weak arc of water over a struggling patch of grass. She made a note on her clipboard and kept going. I remember thinking, in that moment, that she was probably pleased we were conserving. That the barrels might show up as a little gold star on some mental scorecard. It never crossed my mind that we had just become her next project. The first official sign of trouble did not come from her directly. It came through the mail. About 2 weeks after that clipboard walk by, an envelope appeared in our box with the association's logo printed neatly in the corner. It was light beige, not pure white, the kind of deliberate choice that's meant to look formal and important. My stomach tightened a little as I pulled it out, but I told myself it was probably something routine. A newsletter. A budget update. Maybe a reminder about pool hours. Inside was our first violation. The heading at the top read, "Courtesy Notice of Non-Compliance." Below that, in bold, was our address and the date, May 12th. This would later become one of my favorite pieces of evidence, the courtesy notice dated May 12th, the first breadcrumb in a trail of paperwork that would tell the story better than any of us could. The notice informed us that we were in violation of CCR Section 7.4 due to unapproved exterior containers visible from the street. It acknowledged that the city had launched its rain barrel program but pointed out that all exterior modifications remained subject to association approval. It gave us 10 days to correct the issue or submit an application to the architectural committee. It was signed digitally on behalf of the board. 10 days. It felt less like a helpful reminder and more like a countdown. I paced the kitchen with the paper in my hand, reading and rereading the wording. It called our barrels unsightly. It warned that failure to respond could lead to further enforcement actions, including fines and legal costs, as permitted under the governing documents. Every line seemed crafted to sound reasonable and threatening at the same time. From where I stood at the sink, I could see one of the barrels through the side window. It just sat there in the mottled shade, a simple blue shape against the faded siding. It didn't look unsightly to me. It looked responsible. It looked like we were listening to the city, not ignoring it. That's when the anger shifted from a dull cold to something sharper. We weren't repainting the house neon orange. We weren't building a shed in the front yard. We were catching rain during a drought. I pulled out the CCR booklet from the drawer where we kept appliance manuals and warranty cards. The cover smelled faintly musty as I opened it for the first time since we moved in. Flipping through the sections, I found section 7.4. There it was in crisp, legalistic language. Containers. Receptacles. Prior written approval. The more I read, the more ridiculous it felt. The rule seemed written for garbage cans left at the curb for days, or ugly plastic bins piled in front yards. It didn't mention water conservation. It didn't even imagine a world where the city might sponsor something like this. It was a relic from when the biggest worry was whether someone's lawn furniture matched their shutters. Still, the letter was clear: the barrels had to be approved, or they had to go. We could have, in that moment, chosen the easy path. We could have rolled the barrels around to the back, hidden them behind the fence, and hoped the downspouts would reach far enough. We could have filled out whatever form they wanted and waited weeks for some committee to rubber stamp what the city had already endorsed. But that 10-day clock ticked loud in my mind. Not because of the rule, but because of the tone. It was the assumption that we would scramble. That we would bow our heads and apologize for the offense of catching water. The next few days were a blur of emails and policy documents. I read the city's rain barrel FAQ, highlighting lines about environmental benefits and water savings. I pulled a screenshot of the city's own note encouraging residents in HOA communities to work with your association to support conservation. I drafted a calm, detailed response to the board, explaining that we had participated in the city program in good faith and asking how we could align their rules with the city's push for sustainability. I also filled out the architectural committee application they insisted on. It required us to sketch where the barrels sat, list their dimensions, and describe their colors. I wrote that they were positioned as discreetly as possible, that they were neatly maintained, that they directly supported the city's drought response. Then we waited. The association was never quick with anything that benefited homeowners. Weeks could pass between questions and answers. But when it came to enforcement, they moved with surprising speed. 7 days after I sent our response, another envelope arrived. This one was labeled, Final Notice, Imposition of Fines. My heart rate jumped as I tore it open at the kitchen counter. Sunlight slanted across the floor, dust motes drifting in the beam, turning the moment into a frozen photograph in my memory. The letter inside had a different tone. The politeness was thinner. The threat was louder. The board, it said, had reviewed our application and our explanation. They had determined that the barrels remained non-compliant due to visibility from the street and aesthetic inconsistency with neighborhood standards. They referenced a brief line from an architectural committee meeting minutes, dated May 28, where our barrels were described as visually prominent and out of character. Then came the punch: as of June 1, a fine of $100 per day will be imposed until the violation is corrected. That single sentence turned a simple disagreement into a countdown to financial pain. We had just under 2 weeks before we started paying $100 for every day those barrels existed where anyone could see them. The association wasn't just asking for compliance anymore, they were trying to squeeze us into submission. The crazy part was the timing. June 1 was circled on our kitchen calendar for a completely different reason. It was the day the city was scheduled to deliver the second wave of rain barrels for additional participants in the program. The same day the city planned to celebrate conservation, our own association was threatening to punish it. The contrast hit me like a slap. On one side, glossy city posters about sustainability, kids learning to be water-wise, neighbors sharing tips on capturing runoff. On the other, a board clinging to outdated aesthetics and weaponizing fines to enforce them. That's when the theme of the whole fight clicked into place for me. This wasn't a simple property rules issue. This was about who got to decide what being a good neighbor meant, the people actually living on the street, or a handful of rule keepers who thought uniformity outranked survival. The air in the house felt hot and stale as I set the letter down next to the earlier notice. The final notice dated May 12th, and the new fine imposition notice effective June 1st sat side by side, like exhibits on a table. The cicadas outside buzzed louder as the afternoon heat pressed against the windows. In some HOA revenge story videos I had seen online, this would be the point where someone immediately plotted a perfect comeback. I wasn't there yet. I was somewhere between disbelief and calculation, still trying to decide whether we were ready to fight something that could, in theory, put us thousands of dollars in the hole. But the seed was planted. The countdown had begun. And as the number of days until June 1st shrank, the space in my mind for polite compromise shrank with it. We still had time on the clock, and I still thought maybe, somehow, reason could win. What I didn't know yet was that the board, and Ms. D in particular, were just getting warmed up. When the board decided to turn rain into a billable offense, they also underestimated how stubborn I could be. In the days leading up to June 1st, that date glowed in my mind like a digital clock. Every time I walked past the barrels, I visualized a meter ticking upward, $100 at a time. There was a version of this story where we quietly rolled them away the night before the fine started and wrote the whole thing off as an annoying brush with authority. That wasn't the story we were living. Instead, we left them where they were. We kept using them to water the scraggly shrubs and thirsty patch of herbs by the back steps. We logged how much we saved on our municipal bill by not running the hose as often. On the fridge, we stuck the final notice effective June 1st next to the courtesy notice dated May 12th, and every time I grabbed milk or ice, I saw those dates glaring back at me. It felt less like a warning and more like a dare. The morning June 1st finally arrived, the sky was perfectly, insultingly clear. No clouds, no threat of rain, just that relentless bright glare on the asphalt. The barrels stood quiet and full, their plastic surfaces dull in the sun. Somewhere in the neighborhood, sprinklers sputtered to life on their approved schedule, mist catching in the rising heat. No one from the association came by that day. There were no knocks at the door, no inspectors with clipboards. The threat still felt abstract, printed in ink rather than stamped on our bank account. But I knew, somewhere in an office or on a home computer, someone was adding a note to a ledger, fine schedule initiated, $100 per day. The first time those numbers became real was when the monthly statement arrived. At the end of June, another beige envelope appeared in our mailbox. It looked like the usual assessment bill, and in a way it was. Same logo at the top. Same bland greeting. But halfway down the page, under Regular Assessments, a new section had been added, Enforcement Charges. The line item was blunt, June violation, rain barrel noncompliance, 30 days at $100 per day equals $3,000. Below that, there was a small note, per board vote at May 28 Architectural Committee and subsequent ratification, see Enforcement Ledger for details. Attached was a single-page printout that would become another precious prop in the saga, an Enforcement Ledger excerpt through June 30th, with our account highlighted. $3,000. For collecting rain. I stared at the number, feeling the air around me go thin. The background sounds of the house, the hum of the fridge, the soft tick of the thermostat, faded under the roar of blood in my ears. It wasn't hypothetical anymore. The board wasn't bluffing. They were prepared to stack five-figure penalties over plastic barrels during a drought. In that moment, the stakes shifted from mildly annoying to financially dangerous. It wasn't just a petty power trip, it was a direct shot at our savings, our budget, our plans for the year. I spread the pages out on the dining table. The courtesy notice dated May 12th, the fine imposition notice effective June 1st, the enforcement ledger excerpt through June 30th, lined up like a paper timeline of escalation. At the far edge, I placed the CCR booklet open to section 7.4, as if to remind myself how flimsy the foundation was for something so punitive. The more I looked at it, the more it felt like the script to a bad HOA ridiculous rules episode, the kind people share online in disbelief. Only this time, we weren't the audience, we were the punchline. Over the next few weeks, the conflict shifted from paperwork to presence. I started noticing Ms. D more often. She would walk her usual loop around the neighborhood with that same visor and clipboard, but now, when she reached our house, she slowed noticeably. Sometimes she paused to tap her phone. Other times she lifted the clipboard and wrote more than a single quick line. Once, I saw a faint flash reflect off her phone as she angled it toward the barrels. She never spoke to us about it. No knock on the door, no conversation on the sidewalk. Just silent documentation, passing judgments in ballpoint and pixels. Neighbors noticed, too. One afternoon, as I wheeled our trash bin from the curb, a man from 3 houses down gave me an awkward half-smile and said something about tough break with those rain tanks. His eyes slid past me toward where Miss D had just turned the corner. The message was clear, people were talking. In the online neighborhood group, a vague post showed up about compliance issues related to city programs and association rules. It didn't name us, but it didn't have to. Anyone who walked the loop knew exactly whose barrels were visible from the street. We were becoming an example, and not in the way we had hoped. The board, of course, didn't stop with the fines. Mid-July, a new letter arrived, this one labeled Notice of Hearing, Enforcement Review. The date at the top read July 15th, and the subject line cited Ongoing Noncompliance, Unapproved Exterior Containers. The hearing, it said, would take place at the clubhouse on July 25th. We were invited to attend to discuss the matter before further legal remedies were considered. The wording was careful, but the underlying threat was clear. They were gearing up to justify whatever they wanted to do next. By then, the numbers on the ledger were closing in on $5,000. If they kept going for the rest of the summer, we were staring at a 5-figure penalty for refusing to roll 4 barrels out of sight. It was becoming a slow-motion financial game of chicken, and someone was going to flinch. We agreed to attend the hearing, not because we believed they were suddenly going to see reason, but because it was our first chance to get our side into the official record. I had already started treating this like a paper trail in a case file. If they wanted a hearing, we would give them one, and we would bring our own evidence. On the morning of July 25th, the clubhouse smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee that had been on the burner too long. The fluorescent lights washed everything in a flat, tired glow. Folding chairs were arranged in a hesitant semicircle facing a long table where the boards sat with their binders and laptops. At one end of the table, a printed agenda lay turned slightly toward the audience. In small text under Old Business, I could see it, Item 6, Enforcement Actions, Rain Barrels, Lot Number 23. I mentally filed that away as Board Agenda Excerpt, July 25th, another prop in the story of how far they were willing to go. The hearing itself felt less like a conversation and more like a performance. The board members leaned over their papers, flipping to the right pages as Miss D summarized the history of the violation. She referenced the courtesy notice, the final notice, the enforcement ledger, the hearing notice. Each date rolled off her tongue like a victory. She described our barrels as prominent and inconsistent with the community's aesthetic standards, as if painted plastic in drought-friendly shades was an act of rebellion. When it was my turn, I laid out our case. I referenced the city's rain barrel program, holding up the brochure with its cheerful photos and rebate codes. I pointed to the line encouraging residents to work with associations to support conservation. I described our water usage drop since installing the barrels. I even mentioned that the city had chosen our neighborhood as a pilot zone because of how much runoff we were wasting during rare storms. I slid copies of the city brochure and a printout of their online FAQ across the table. I also placed the CCR booklet open to section 7.4 in front of them, stressing how broadly it was written, how it clearly predated any concept of city-sponsored conservation tools. They listened. They nodded. They took notes. Then, when they spoke, it was as if none of it mattered. The board's position, they said, was that containers visible from the street required prior approval, and ours had been installed without it. The architectural committee had carefully considered our application and determined that the visual impact remained unacceptable. The rain barrels might be commendable in theory, but in practice, they disrupted the harmonious appearance of the neighborhood. The fines, they explained, were necessary to maintain compliance and protect property values. I realized then that this wasn't about water or even about rules. It was about control. About someone like Ms. D believing that a consistent sightline of front facades mattered more than drought, conservation, or common sense. We left the hearing with no resolution, only a vague promise of a written decision. A week later, that decision arrived. The board had affirmed the ongoing imposition of fines and reserved the right to pursue all legal remedies available under the governing documents, including the placement of a lien if the balance remained unpaid. The ledger total ticked higher. Their patience ticked lower. At the same time, something else was happening, almost as important as the fines themselves. The neighborhood was choosing sides. Some people avoided eye contact when they drove by, their windows rolled up tight. Others slowed down to glance at the barrels, at our front yard, at the envelopes that seemed to arrive every other week. A couple of bolder neighbors made a point of waving, of stopping in the street to chat about the weather or the latest city restrictions, their eyes flicking toward the barrels with quiet approval. Then came the newsletter. Late summer, the association distributed its quarterly update. Tucked between a note about pool rules and a reminder about holiday decorations was a paragraph that made my stomach knot. It was written in that vague, passive style that hides sharp edges. It described ongoing enforcement against certain homeowners who have installed unapproved exterior fixtures in disregard of the community standards. It mentioned that these actions come at great cost to the association and ultimately to all homeowners, and urged everyone to comply promptly with board directives to avoid similar measures. They didn't name us. They didn't need to. We were the only ones on the street with barrels still visible. The shame wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. We were being held up as an example, a quiet warning to anyone else who might think about bending a rule in the name of practicality. What the board did not realize was that their attempt to shame us was also the moment our quiet frustration turned into something louder, something closer to collective defiance. Because if they could target us over rain barrels, they could target anyone over anything that didn't fit their idea of a perfect postcard. The whispers started on driveways and in the small strip of shade under a shared tree. One neighbor mentioned how their drought-tolerant front landscape had been criticized for having too many rocks and not enough turf. Another talked about being told to remove solar pathway lights because they were not in keeping with community standards. Someone else had been warned about a small pollinator garden near the sidewalk. It was a pattern, not an accident. The association had turned adaptation into transgression. Around that time, one of the more plugged-in neighbors slipped a copy of a board packet into my hands. It was a thick stapled bundle summarizing recent meetings, including financials and enforcement updates. In it, there was a section titled Legal Affairs, with a short note about consultation with Association Counsel regarding ongoing enforcement of container violations and potential lien placement. Next to it, someone had scribbled a date, attorney letter dated August 3rd. A week later, that letter showed up in our mailbox. It was printed on heavy paper from a small law firm the association used. The subject line said, Notice of Intent to Place Lien, Outstanding Fines. It recited the history: May 12th courtesy notice, June 1st fine initiation, July 25th hearing, board's decision to continue enforcement. It stated that if the balance remained unpaid by a date in early September, the association may proceed with recording a lien against the property in accordance with the governing documents and state law. The letter didn't spell out every step. It didn't need to. Anyone who has ever heard a story like this knows where it can go: liens, collection actions, even foreclosure in the most extreme cases. The specific legal path was murky, but the direction was clear enough. As I stood there with that letter in my hand, the late afternoon sun slanting through the blinds in thin stripes, I knew we had reached the limit of playing defense. We were not just dealing with annoying oversight anymore. We were dealing with a small group of people comfortable using legal levers to force compliance over something as basic as catching rain. By late summer, the board had stacked thousands of dollars in fines against us, used us as an example in their newsletter, and escalated to attorney letters threatening a lien, all because we refused to hide 4 city-approved rain barrels. We had tried reason, documentation, and hearings, and each time they doubled down on control over community. The next move would not be another email or plea, it would be a shift in the balance of power. The more they pushed, the more it became obvious that this wasn't just our fight. It was everyone's who had ever been told their small attempt to adapt, or to express themselves, was out of character for a place they paid to live in. That realization changed everything. The turning point came on one of those shimmering hot evenings when the air barely moved and the sky felt like a blank wall. A neighbor from around the corner stopped by, carrying a folder pressed flat against their side. They had attended the last board meeting, they said, and listened as our case came up again. In the open forum portion, they had heard other homeowners murmur about overreach and priorities. They had seen the tight set of the treasurer's jaw, the way Ms. D bristled when anyone questioned the enforcement budget line. Inside the folder was a copy of another board agenda excerpt, this one for an upcoming September meeting. Near the bottom, in smaller text, was a line that caught my eye: discussion, City Rain Barrel Program and Association Image. It wasn't just about us anymore. They were worried how they looked. That gave us our angle. If the association cared so much about image, then the most effective leverage might not be a lawsuit or another hearing. It might be public attention. The city had pushed this program. The association was resisting it. Somewhere in that tension, there was a story that went beyond our cul-de-sac. We started reaching out. Quietly, at first, we spoke with neighbors we knew were frustrated or had their own run-ins with enforcement. We did not try to convince everyone. We focused on those who had been told their rock gardens were messy, or their native plants were overgrown, or their solar panels were visually disruptive. There were more of them than we realized. In front yards and over fences, we shared copies of our notices, the enforcement ledger excerpt, and the attorney's letter. We showed them the city's brochure and FAQ. We explained that the board wasn't just scolding us, they were threatening legal action over conservation. What started as sympathy soon turned into something sharper. People were tired of being told that survival and basic adaptation were less important than matching mailboxes and hedge heights. A small group of us met one evening in a shaded backyard, the cicadas singing like static in the trees. We brought our own stacks of paper, board agendas, notices, screenshots of the city's conservation page. We spread them across a patio table and started mapping a plan. The idea we settled on was simple, almost disarmingly so. The city was already planning a late summer, water-wise weekend workshop at a nearby community center. They were encouraging neighborhoods to host their own conservation-themed events. We would take that invitation and turn it into something the board couldn't ignore. We would organize a neighborhood water-saving protest disguised as a community event. On the surface, it would be a block-wide participation in the city's water-wise weekend. Residents would sign up for rain barrels through the city program or purchase their own. They would drag out every barrel they had, new or old, and line them neatly where they were most visible from the street. They would display signs about conservation and data about water savings. We would invite the city's conservation coordinator to speak. At the heart of it, though, it would be a rebuke. A row of barrels on lawn after lawn, turning our street into a living chart of how far the association was willing to go to stop something everyone else in the city supported. We picked a date that fell just before that September board meeting where Association Image was on the agenda. We gave it an innocuous name that sounded like a workshop, not a revolt. We created an email list and a small group chat to coordinate deliveries and installations. For once, the board wasn't the only one building a paper trail. Someone suggested inviting local media, not a big crew, just a community reporter who covered city initiatives and neighborhood stories. Someone else offered to reach out to the city's conservation department to let them know how their program was being treated on our street. The plan wasn't to embarrass for the sake of drama, it was to put truth in daylight where control tends to shrink. We even considered the rules as carefully as they did. We reviewed the CCRs again, noting where they were vague and where they contradicted city guidelines. We talked about how far we could go without giving them an easy way to shut the whole thing down on a technicality. The goal wasn't chaos. It was a calm, collective display of priorities. As we worked through the details, the air in that backyard felt different from the heavy, stagnant evenings of the past weeks. There was tension, yes, but also a current of energy. For the first time since the courtesy notice dated May 12, it felt like we were not just reacting but directing. The board thought their attorney's letter and threats of liens would scare us into submission, but all it did was push us toward a pressure point they couldn't manage with fines, a moment where their own governing documents and the city's policies would collide in public. If they insisted on turning this into a legal battlefield, they were about to discover that rules cut both ways. By the time we left that backyard, the plan was in motion. The date was selected. Neighbors had pledged to line their yards with barrels, to print simple conservation facts, to stand in their driveways and talk, not shout, not argue, just calmly explain why catching rain was not an act of defiance but of responsibility. We walked home under a hazy, pale sky, the streetlights humming softly as they flicked on. Our 4 blue barrels sat exactly where they had always been, framed in the yellow glow from our porch. Only now, they no longer felt like solitary pieces of evidence in some homeowners association drama. They were the first 4 in a line that was about to stretch the whole length of the block. The weeks between planning and execution felt like living in a countdown again, but this time the deadline belonged to us. Every day, little pieces of the plan clicked into place. The city confirmed that a conservation coordinator could stop by our block on the Waterwise weekend to answer questions. A local community reporter agreed to swing through and highlight residents participating in the city program. Neighbors forwarded emails showing their new rain barrel orders and delivery dates. The group chat filled with photos of driveways and side yards marked with little flags where barrels would go. On the surface, it looked like a friendly neighborhood workshop. Underneath, it was a coordinated pushback against control. The board caught wind of it sooner than we expected. A few days before the event, an email blast went out from the association with the subject line, "Reminder, exterior modifications and containers." It reiterated the same line from CCR Section 7.4, stressed the need for prior approval, and hinted that participation in city programs does not override community standards. The tone was clipped, almost brittle. They did not mention the event by name. They did not have to. Everyone on our block read that email while looking at their freshly delivered barrels or tracking numbers. The evening before the Waterwise weekend, the sky turned a soft, hazy orange as the sun slid down, and the heat finally bled out of the pavement. One by one, neighbors rolled their barrels into position, testing downspout connections, lining them where they would be clearly visible from the street. The sound of plastic scraping softly across concrete mixed with the distant chirp of crickets waking up in the dry grass. Standing on the sidewalk, I could see at least a dozen barrels already in place before it was even dark. For the first time since the courtesy notice dated May 12, our 4 barrels didn't look exposed. They looked like part of a pattern. By the time morning came, the board's threat had shifted. If they wanted to keep pretending this was about one stubborn homeowner, they were about to run into a wall of matching blue and black plastic, all lined up on a single street, in full view of a city official and a camera lens that cared more about conservation than control. The sun rose early and bright the next day, pouring through thin clouds and turning the rows of barrels into a line of dull, gleaming sentries. The air was still cool enough to feel hopeful, carrying the low murmur of neighbors chatting and the faint rustle of paper signs being taped to fences. Each yard had its own small display. Some people printed out city infographics about water savings. Others wrote simple numbers on poster board, "This barrel saves approximately X gallons per storm." A few kids had helped decorate with small drawings of raindrops and wilting plants revived by captured water. From the top of the cul-de-sac, the street looked different. Not chaotic, not messy, just intentional. It was like our block had suddenly decided to be honest about the drought instead of pretending the grass could survive on wishes and restricted sprinklers. The board made their entrance mid-morning. A small cluster of them walked up the street together, wearing name tags and tight expressions. Ms. D led the group, her clipboard clutched tighter than usual, visor pulled low against the glare. Behind her, the treasurer and a couple of committee members followed, their eyes flicking from barrel to barrel as if counting potential violations. They slowed as they approached the densest stretch of displays. At that exact moment, the city's conservation coordinator arrived, a person with a stack of handouts, a lanyard badge, and a calm, practiced smile. The community reporter followed a few steps behind, camera dangling, notebook in hand, the lens catching the way sunlight hit the tops of the barrels. For a few seconds, the two groups just occupied the same space, like two fronts of a weather system colliding in the middle of our block. The coordinators started doing what they were there to do, explaining how rain barrels worked, answering questions about rebates, pointing to diagrams. Neighbors listened, nodding, occasionally gesturing toward their own setups. The camera picked up shots of the barrels, the signs, the quiet pride in people's faces. It didn't take long for someone to mention the conflict. In careful, measured terms, we laid out the situation: city-sponsored barrels, association fines, an attorney letter threatening a lien, the enforcement ledger with thousands of dollars against us. We showed the enforcement ledger excerpt through June 30th, the attorney letter dated August 3rd, and the board's own agenda references to container violations. We did not shout. We just held up the paper trail and let it speak. The coordinator's expression shifted from polite interest to something closer to concern. They asked to see our notices. They took photos. They made a few notes of their own. The reporter, sensing a deeper story, leaned in. If the board thought this would be a contained embarrassment, they miscalculated. In a matter of minutes, the conflict had jumped from private emails and beige envelopes into a space where city policy, state guidance, and public perception intersected, and that's a place where control by fear does not hold up well. The board tried to pivot. They talked about harmony, aesthetics, and the importance of uniform standards. They made vague references to property values and precedent. They mentioned that one homeowner had refused to comply and forced the association to escalate. But every time they spoke about unapproved containers, the coordinator gently brought the conversation back to conservation. They explained that the city encouraged residents to capture rain. They referenced guidance that associations should not unreasonably interfere with water-saving devices. They mentioned that, in some areas, higher-level regulations explicitly protected things like rain barrels. They did not give legal advice. They did not issue threats. They simply laid out how out of step an association looked when it punished the very behavior the city was paying people to adopt. The reporter asked the kind of questions that make people squirm. Things like why the association believed front yard symmetry outweighed drought response. Or how they justified fines that had climbed into the thousands over devices the city referred to as essential conservation tools. The board had answers, but they sounded smaller each time they were spoken under the open sky, with barrels lined up on every side and cameras catching every tight-lipped response. By the time the impromptu interviews ended, the tension in the air felt thick, like the charged silence before a storm. The city coordinator promised to follow up with the association and provide additional clarification on policy alignment. The reporter walked away with more than enough material for a piece that would frame the entire thing as exactly what it was: a clash between outdated control and necessary adaptation. That afternoon, as the heat settled back over the street and the barrels cast short, dark shadows on the grass, the board met in private. We did not see exactly what happened in that room. We only saw the results. Within a week, a new email went out to the entire community. It was longer than most, written in the strained, overly careful tone of people trying to climb down from a position without admitting they had been wrong. The board announced that they were re-evaluating policies regarding water conservation devices in light of recent discussions with city officials. They acknowledged the importance of supporting drought response efforts. They said they would be suspending enforcement actions related to rain barrels while they drafted updated guidelines. There was a single sentence buried in the middle that made my shoulders finally loosen. It said the association would be reviewing and adjusting prior enforcement charges related to rain barrels to conform with revised policy. The official change came a couple of weeks later, in the form of a formal resolution. It was labeled Policy Resolution 2023-2009, Rainwater Capture and Conservation Devices. The document stated that rain barrels meeting certain basic parameters, securely installed, in good repair, neutral or coordinating colors, were permitted, including those visible from the street, as long as they did not block sidewalks or create safety issues. The fines on our ledger did not just stop growing. They disappeared. On the next association statement, the enforcement charges section looked different. Instead of a mountain of line items, there was a single entry, adjustment, reversal of container enforcement per policy resolution 2023-2009, $X. The balance dropped back to zero, like someone had finally taken their thumb off a scale that had been tipping hard in one direction. They did not apologize. But the numbers told the story anyway. Not long after that, we heard that Ms. D was stepping down as president. The announcement cited personal reasons and a desire to focus on other commitments. The treasurer did not run for another term. In their place, a slate of new candidates stepped up, people who had stood under the trees in our yards, listening to the city coordinator, watching the line of barrels shimmer in the sun. The association did not transform overnight into a utopia. There were still rules. There were still complaints about holiday decorations and parking. But something fundamental had shifted. We now had a sustainability committee instead of an architectural committee that treated every adaptation like an offense. That committee worked with the city on rebates and guidelines. They sent out emails inviting people to workshops instead of threatening them with beige envelopes. They still cared about standards, but they finally cared about survival too. As for our barrels, they stayed exactly where they had always been. We did make a few changes. We painted them in a soft, muted color that matched the trim of our house, not because someone ordered us to, but because we wanted them to look intentional. We added small labels noting approximate capacity and gallons saved during bigger storms. Sometimes, when the clouds finally gathered and rain hammered on the roof, I would stand by the window and listen to the quiet glug of water filling them, the sound soft under the patter like a hidden metronome. The conflict had cost us time, energy, and more stress than I like to admit. But it had also done something the board never expected. It reminded the neighborhood that we were a community before we were a set of controlled facades. The people on our block had chosen to line their yards, open their doors, and stand together in the shimmering heat to push back against a handful of signatures on enforcement letters. In the end, that mattered more than any one barrel. Tell me your worst rain barrel HOA horror in one line.